Reality Transurfing, Book 4, Ruling Reality, by Vadim Zeland. Chapter 1, Dancing with the Shadows, Stabilizing the Structure. Stabilizing the structure. In accordance with its law, a pendulum does everything to increase the energy of any conflict that has arisen. Battles from which pendulums draw energy are always going on around us, but these conflicts usually arise between two or several opposing structures. There are plenty of examples of this: wars, revolutions, market competition, and other types of counteraction. However, along with aggression towards its enemies, the distinguishing feature of any pendulum is the drive to maintain and strengthen the structure that makes a pendulum's existence possible. The energy information entity is created and developed simultaneously with the appearance of an ordered structure created by the representatives of the animate nature. The existence of a pendulum is wholly dependent on the extent to which the newly created structure is stable. Therefore, it will do everything in order to stabilize the structure. Let me repeat that. It will do everything in order to stabilize the structure. That is the second pendulum law. To illustrate what I mean, let's look at the most straightforward example: a school of little fish. The school behaves as a single organism. If you scare it at one end, all the little fishes will turn around and swim away synchronously. Where does the synchronism come from? If we were to assume that every single fish reacts to the movement of its neighbor, then the disturbance must be passed down the chain. However, regardless of the speed of the signal transmission, there still has to be a time delay. But that's the thing. There is no delay. The school can reach rather large proportions, but that makes no difference. The same synchronism is observed. Birds behave in a similar way. If you ever had the opportunity to witness a large flock consisting of small and fast little birds, you must have noticed that their moving back and forth is distinguished by amazing coordination. Perhaps there is another mechanism at work here. For example, telepathy? But that too is not very likely. Take a pond where there are no schools. If you frighten a fish, another fish swimming only a meter away will stay quite calm. So it turns out there isn't any telepathy involved. The signal is passed on only within a school of fish, which in itself is the simplest of structures. However, perhaps the signal is not passed on at all. Let's take a higher level structure, an anthill, for instance. Science is unable to provide a persuasive answer for how a colony of ants is run. After all, what's amazing is that there is a clear allocation of duties in an anthill, but there is no hierarchy. So why do all the insects act in a coordinated manner, like an organization run by central control? Ants communicate by excreting odorous substances, pheromones. The odor trails allow them to find their way home and locate their food. But by what means is this information passed on to all the members of the colony at the same time? Any higher means of information exchange are out of the question. Otherwise, why would they use such a primitive data set as odors? So what unites separate members into an organized colony? A pendulum does. At the same time as a structure is created, and during its subsequent development, an energy information entity is formed, which takes on the function of controlling and stabilizing the structure. There is a direct connection and a feedback loop between a pendulum and the structure elements. A pendulum exists at the expense of the energy of its followers and synchronizes their activity, uniting them into one organized society. It may appear from the outside that the structure is somehow organizing itself, but this is not the case. Self-organization can only occur in inanimate nature, where the laws of physics act as the controlling element. For example, the molecules of any liquid during the process of crystallization are arranged into a lattice, the structure of which is determined by the shape of the molecules and the interacting forces. For living organisms to become united in a structure, the presence of an external organizing factor is required, and that factor is the pendulum. How it does what it does is still unknown. To all appearances, there is a specific energy information exchange between this entity and a living organism. A pendulum as a controlling superstructure can be found in any structure that brings living organisms together. However, you cannot say that a pendulum executes intelligent control over any structure, because it does not have conscious intention. The consciousness of an energy information entity is much like an algorithm. A pendulum does not implement its plans like an intelligent being. It manages the structure in the same way as a program manages the work of an automatic device. The degree of automaticity in the actions of the structure's elements depends on the level of their consciousness. The more primitive a living being, the less idea it has about its own motives and actions. If a creature lives in isolation, then its actions are determined by an internal program, a set of instincts. But when living beings come together in groups, an external program, a pendulum, immediately joins in and starts controlling the behavior of the community. The aggressiveness of the world where everyone eats each other developed as a result of the first pendulum rule. The aggression that is a product of pendulums is far from a necessary feature of animate nature, and this finds support in various separate corners of our planet. For instance, there are practically no predators in New Zealand. A great many inhabitants of the planet have come together in groups in order to survive in an unsafe environment. Pendulums force living beings to turn into elements of a structure by the principle, "Well, little chicken, do you want to live? Then do as I do." People, too, are disposed towards assembling into interest groups. This is explained by the fact that it is easier to communicate with others this way. Perhaps it may seem strange that the vast majority of people have considerable difficulties in communicating with others. Despite the apparent effortlessness of interpersonal relations, they are quite strained, and this is due to quite a number of external and internal causes. In order to establish a more intimate contact, people instinctively try to find something in common, something that could unite them in one way or another. This is where the stabilizing function of pendulums becomes apparent. When discussion partners are swinging on the same pendulum, they are tuned into one wave and have no trouble finding common ground. That is why it becomes easier to interact with others when you can have a smoke, a drink together, sit at a dinner table, go hiking, play a game, and so on. But perhaps the most impressive illustration of the second pendulum law is the birth of civilization. Have you ever thought about why cities came into being? Why hundreds of thousands of years ago did people live in villages and nomad camps and then suddenly start building great civilized settlements? What initiated the urge to build? Craft making, trade, or perhaps war? The most ancient cities are as old as pyramids. One of these, Caral, was discovered quite recently in Peru. This lost city remained unknown for almost 5,000 years. It was detected when it turned out that the hills rising up in the middle of a desert were actually pyramids back in the day, and one of them was just as big as the ones in Egypt. Archaeologists were surprised by the fact that despite their excavations, they were unable to find any pottery or weapons. People used primitive tools made out of stone, bone, and wood. It was established that the city folk grew cotton, made fish nets, and exchanged these for fish from those living on the shore. However, people could live in a village and make their living just the same. There were no defense structures around Caral, so military prehistory is also out of the question. What then accounts for the city having become established there? From ancient times, people lived in villages, engaged in primitive handicrafts for a living, did some trade, and waged internecine wars. And to be able to do all that, they did not need to construct cities made of stone or to erect pyramids. In all likelihood, pendulums, or rather their stabilizing function, served as the organizing factor. One cannot account for the exact process by which this happens, but the truth is always somewhere nearby. Most likely, at a given moment, a pendulum structure within which lies the ability for further development is spontaneously created. A city is, after all, a complex hierarchy of production, consumption, and exchange pendulums. And if, by its structure, the self-organizing system proves to be stable from the very beginning, then it will expand and grow stronger. The evolution of the structure can eventually result in a complex civilization being formed, and this process will continue until some defect in architecture brings the gigantic construction crumbling down. Of course, that's still in the distant future, but it all depends, ... However, let's get back to our life. Man, in comparison to other representatives of the animate nature, is more awake. But is he always aware of his actions? The human mind can create complex devices and mechanisms, build cities, research the world. And yet, in the sense of consciousness, man hasn't gotten very far from the animal world. The whole of human society is organized in a complex structure, consisting of separate formations from families to large corporations and governments. Just as in nature, if you lead an isolated existence, then you are the one responsible for your actions. As is well known, those individuals who move away from society become enlightened. But when a person becomes an element of a structure, he is, to a large extent, sleeping awake, which nevertheless doesn't prevent his mind from engaging in high-tech production. A modern factory is much more complex than an anthill. However, in essence, both are structures that are controlled by pendulums. And if one were to view together all the achievements brought about by scientific and technological advances, it would be obvious that they are all products of a structure, not of separate individuals. One man can invent the TV set, Yet television is a product of an entire system, controlled by a pendulum. When you become an element of a structure, you have to follow the pendulum rule. As a result, you get an inevitable contradiction between personal interests and conditions, forced on you by the structure. The worst-case scenario is when you are not aware of this fact and toil away obediently by the sweat of your brow within the system, with no time to lift your head to look around and become aware of your actions. You may object. What kind of nonsense is this? Why do you say I am not aware of what I am doing? On the contrary, I am perfectly aware of what I am doing, why and for what reason I am doing it. Not likely. As a striking example, one could take children's summer camps. The yet-to-be-established psyche of teenagers who are relatively free from being classified serves as fertile ground for the growth of pendulums. Pendulums, by virtue of their aggressive nature, create an environment where a competitive spirit flourishes. In this environment, if you are not like everyone else, that is, if you do not correspond to the parameters of the formed structure, you may be a laughingstock, be driven away from the flock, or simply get beaten up. Under such conditions, a teenager is sleeping awake, and he's sleeping like a log. He lives as if in a dream, unaware of his actions, be it in a crowd or in opposition to it. The sedative in this case is the heavy feeling of competitive relationships and the severe doubts the teenager has about his own adequacy and fitting the set standards. This feeling of oppression and vigilance is always there, even if on the outside the teenager is calm and full of energy. This kind of oppression, bordering on hopelessness, is the same as that experienced in an unconscious dream, where you are entirely at the mercy of unfolding events. Life in an aggressive environment happens in a similar way to a dream. The rapid flow of events rushes you forward, and all your awareness is reduced to staying afloat, gawking around in fear. If the teenager hasn't got an inner core of confidence, he instinctively, you could say, unconsciously starts looking for a point of support that will allow him to strengthen his status. And the pendulum is one to offer this support, though not for free, but in exchange for submitting to the rules of the structure. One may often notice in an environment similar to summer camps that you can get certain rollicking individuals who are seemingly 100% sure of themselves and taking to everything like ducks to water. All their false confidence is held up by a point of support provided by a pendulum. Imagine two such owners of support. One a slacker, another a prankster. Hey, you, look at me. Do as I do. Do as I do. Hey, you, don't be a retard. Stop waiting around. Kick back. Do the monkey. No one around them realizes that these two are dangling on the pendulum's hook, like puppets. The point of support, although ephemeral, is responsible for the illusion that they have created. Others, watching the imaginary confidence of these puppets, do exactly the same. They get the point of support in exchange for compliance with the rule, do as I do. And so they all keep dangling as one, both the slackers and the pranksters. The main point is that a pendulum's adherents submit to its rule while being entirely unaware of it. They fall completely under the illusion that this is how it should be. By following the rule, adherents can do whatever they want, but they all do it the same way. For example, teenagers no longer use foul language to swear. Foul language is just how they talk nowadays. It doesn't even occur to anyone that it is a vulgar thing to do. Yet vulgarity is basically about bad taste. It's low class. It's the same as not taking care of personal hygiene and walking around in dirty clothes. Teenagers don't wear dirty clothes at the moment, but they definitely will as soon as there's a rule telling them not to do so. For example, at the court of French King Louis IX, washing oneself wasn't considered appropriate because the king himself had a pathological aversion to hygiene, reducing it to only washing his hands with cognac. The members of the court were forced to follow his example, so in order to cover up the unpleasant smell coming from their bodies, they poured lots of perfume on themselves. As a result, there was a heavy stench throughout the palace. And one more note. Because the entire court was also suffering from lice as a result of this poor hygiene, they came up with a refined habit. Dames and cavaliers carried sticks with them at all times, which they used to gracefully scratch themselves. Evidently, the rule can rehabilitate absolutely any kind of nonsense. But the important thing is that the followers of the rule in their great mass act in the same uniform way like a flock of sheep. For example, whoever it was who first said the word cool can consider himself a shepherd. As for the rest of us, like parrots, saying these and similar words in chorus are undoubtedly acting like sheep. And now let's recall the school of little fish. Has man progressed much in his consciousness? It's not only teenagers who are exposed to the influence of pendulums, but adults as well, especially when they are in a crowd. For example, at a meeting, when there is a common discussion about someone or something, a person may suddenly get up, a thing he would never expect himself to do, and start actively ranting on. Later he will be perplexed, wondering how on earth he went through with it, but then he'll start convincing himself that he said all the right things. A crowd often makes its members behave in a way that is uncharacteristic of them. That is the effect a pendulum has on those looking for a point of support. It would seem that people find support in a structure, and that's fine. What difference does it make? Certainly that too is a way out, but one should keep in mind that if you submit to the rules of the structure, you'll have to forget about your individuality. You'll be like everyone else, and you'll get peace and safety. But at the same time, you will lose your God-given gift, the uniqueness of your soul, which makes everything ingenious happen. Not to mention that there can never be any notion of unity between your soul and mind. A person who is completely at the mercy of a structure is practically unconscious and does not hear the voice of his soul. Let me repeat that. A person who is completely at the mercy of a structure is practically unconscious and does not hear the voice of his soul. And that means that he will never be able to find his path and will spend all his life slaving away for the benefit of the structure. But what I really don't mean to say is that your path is to be found outside of any kind of structure. You could retire to the mountains and cut yourself off from the world of pendulums, but if your life continues to be an unconscious dream, if you continue to sleep awake, then absolutely nothing will change. I'm talking about becoming the master of your fate, while remaining in the structure. For example, could you get the confidence you desire without submitting to the pendulum rule and without turning into an outcast at the same time? Easily. All you need to do is simply wake up and look at the game with the eyes of a spectator, without leaving the stage. Then the pendulum's favorites, the slackers and the pranksters, and the adherents who follow the pendulum rule will immediately become visible to you. The only thing you cannot do is judge, or what's even worse, despise other people. If, as a result of becoming aware of the situation, you start comparing yourself to those who are asleep, dependent relationships will occur, polarization will tighten, and the awakened will inevitably become an outcast. It's very important to remember that rejecting the pendulum rule is not enough. You have to replace it with the Transurfing rule. Let yourself be you, and let a different person be different. That is when you will be able to find the point of support within yourself. Understanding what is going on around you is already half the battle. This knowledge alone brings solid and calm belief in yourself, because lack of self-confidence springs from the fear of the unknown. When a person is unfamiliar with the rules of the game, he starts seeing the world around him as frightening and hostile. And then feelings of loneliness and depression come over him, making him fall asleep and submit to the pendulum rule. So knowing all this, you are now able to turn your life into a waking dream and hence get control over the situation. Either become a shepherd or at the very least stop being a sheep. What you should do to improve your position I have already discussed at length in the theory of transurfing. First, get rid of any guilt. In order to do this, you have to stop justifying yourself and stop explaining your actions to those who have the audacity to judge you. Let me repeat that. First of all, get rid of any guilt. In order to do this, you have to stop justifying yourself and stop explaining your actions to those who have the audacity to judge you. Second, stop defending and proving your significance. If you follow the transurfing rule at the same time, then these two things will be quite enough to get a point of support within yourself. That is, to start living in accordance with your credo. However, you should keep in mind that you cannot just thoughtlessly oppose yourself to the structure and attempt to get rid of its influence by any means possible. I repeat, we're not talking about completely getting rid of pendulums, but about not being their puppet. Once you've woken up, you'll be able to feel and understand the ways in which the structure is putting pressure on you. Do you want to live? In an attempt to force its rules on you. Then you'll be able to decide for yourself whether to relinquish these rules or follow them. The main thing is to do it mindfully. While everyone else around you is asleep, that is what the strategy of the master of the situation entails. As an example, let's take one typical letter. Why does it sometimes happen that when you're doing a good job or doing even more than you're supposed to, like suggesting new ideas, which are well received, nobody notices? And why does it sometimes happen that when you're doing a good job or doing even more than you're supposed to do, like suggesting new ideas, which are well received, nobody notices and someone else gets the credit for your work? Even if the issue is related to getting a raise, I am quickly forgotten, as if they hadn't got a raise planned for me. And even if they do offer me a slightly higher post, then in the process of assigning me into a different post, my place gets taken by a different person, or the whole process comes to a halt. It seems I'm some sort of invisible person. Why does this happen? Apparently, the female reader who asked the question above works in some kind of administrative system. Any system is a pendulum. At first, an energy information structure appears in the shape of an array of ideas and principles, which then develop into its material manifestation, that is, a system. The system starts developing on its own, subjecting adherents to its laws. Pendulums put their adherents in key positions, not because of their high merits, but because they comply with the system to a greater extent. It would be naive to think that on a career ladder, and especially in the hierarchy of power, people are arranged according to their distinguishing qualities and achievements. That is true to a certain extent, but distinguishing qualities and achievements are not the main criteria. The main criteria does not consist of how well you do your job, but how appropriately you do it from the point of view of the system. A pendulum is primarily concerned with stability, and that is why, in the first place, you should orient your actions towards maintaining the stability of the system. If you want to move up the career ladder, you must understand the difference between good and appropriate. Here, everything depends on the group of staff in question. Pendulums, too, can be different. In smaller teams, creativity, independence, enthusiasm, and initiative may be encouraged. But if it is management personnel or a large business, then completely different laws and completely different ethics apply, those of a corporate nature. Corporate ethics involves more stringent regulations, discipline, and diligence. Initiative-taking is often punished, independence is met with vigilance, and creativity is not essential. In a system such as that, you should not act better, but more appropriately. Therefore, you need to act consciously and flexibly, adjusting your actions to the realities of the pendulum world. But it is not all as complicated as it may seem. The important thing is to wake up in time. End segment.